Right, welcome to the show. This is the part where we just, talk to ground shapers that, of course, have got a massive impact in society. Because this is somebody who's not just talking about one topic, but is generally concerned about our country and, of course, human rights. At least this is what I'd like to think from the interactions that we've had. So let me take this time to welcome you, Dumiso Gacha. Thank you so much for coming to the show.
Hi, Roberta. Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, you are the founder of Success Capital. First of all, what a name, Success Capital. Oof. The capital of success. Explain it to me. What does that mean?
So I think for many young people, we know that they're in a perpetual state of survival. And so I think when we sat down and had conversations to try to figure out how are we different and how do we reshape the narratives around young people. And so we acknowledged we want to move young people from a state of survival to one of success. And then from a community asset-based perspective, we're recognizing you're not developing a young person. You're strengthening their capacity because they already have a foundation of skills, resilience, talent that isn't harnessed, that isn't reflected in a lot of policy making or the world.
Ooh, drops mic. I think I should just ask you one question and leave you do the rest. Very beautiful. I guess you've kind of given us, a bit of a glimpse. Just Success Capital, when was it founded and also its purpose?
So a lot of people don't know, one of the first times that we wanted to start a Pride, for example, was in 2013, October 6th. And I remember at the time, we didn't necessarily have a lot of support as young people.
Definitely.
And so, we met at the Game Reserve. And I think the fact that we didn't get support from the main mother body, as one would say, is where we sat and then sort of figured, but we don't need other people, right? And we can do it on our own.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it was birthed. However, we were only registered by March 2015.
Okay.
Obviously acknowledging that LGBT issues were not the most popular, they were not palatable enough, for decision makers. And so I think for us, it's recognizing a lot of work that we're doing is not just about human rights, but it's also about the fact that a lot of people are denied dignity and personhood in terms of service delivery.
Wow.
And so we then realized, a person holistically, we're talking about the nexus of human rights and sustainable development. And so I think in just the founding principle of recognizing socioeconomic rights, even when it wasn't allowed back then, and acknowledging a lot of young people need some element of empowerment, whether it's education, whether it's being trained that, I can exercise agency, in a retail service environment. And so I think for us...
That sounds particularly very tough.
Yeah, it's not easy, because
very
for people
unacceptable for what people are
that they have rights.
Yeah.
It's very difficult, right? Especially in a way that would be considered disrespectful.
Yeah.
And so I think, it's a lot of work, to be honest. And I think also just recognizing there's a lot of harmful gender norms. That means there's gender parity as well. So you can imagine what it means when we're trying to unlock someone's potential and to have them safeguard and speak for themselves. So that takes a lot of work. And so I think ultimately for us, it's about trying to unleash that individual, because that individual is the one that is productive, and that individual is the one that can help move the country forward.
With everything you're saying, especially saying, I don't know if you noticed that I was quite stunned that you said 2013, because I can just remember that around that time, I think issues like this were slowly raising, kind of reaching Africa a little bit more. But if we gave you a stage back then and you spoke about, what you're speaking about today, you definitely have tomatoes thrown at you. Yeah. And I can imagine that with the amount of ignorance that I often observe as a journalist myself, that could still be the case in different places. Slightly more palatable in, places that are developed. So I just want to start with understanding what I guess you've kind of explained what motivated it, but I just want to understand the young you. Is this something that you were hungry for from a young age?
So I had the privilege of schooling in South Africa from high school to varsity. And I remember in leaving varsity, because we're talking about post-apartheid South Africa, in a very toxic environment. And I think I found myself telling myself I will never be a victim again. This is specifically because I had a friend who had gone through something that I never realized I was a victim of, you know?
Okay.
And so that shows you how violence was deeply normalized.
Are you able to share what you're talking about?
So essentially, you know, one of my friends, Lea Neke Motswana, so we're all schooling in the Northwest region, and you know, she was speaking about how a certain individual from Orapa, so we're all people from outside South Africa, you know, ended up doing certain things, the same mannerisms, the same behavior, the same breath, the same way that she had been held, were all the things that had happened to me 6 years before in a boarding school.
Ooh.
And so you can imagine being someone where I skipped standard 7, who was 3 years younger than everyone. And this, so essentially this meant that this person was 4 years older than me.
Yeah.
And then trying to take advantage of me as an adolescent.
Oh
and
my.
what that means, you know, when you don't necessarily have parents around because you're in a boarding school, what that means when you can't reconcile or even know, this is not okay.
Yeah.
It's not acceptable that someone's breath and I'm feeling other elements of anatomy against me at 2 a.m. after you have plowed me with alcohol as an adolescent.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, it took me a very, very long time to sort of recognize that, you know what, that was not okay. And, you know, I was then asking myself, why am I only seeing one activist? It didn't make sense. You know, human rights wasn't necessarily the most popular thing. And, you know, there I am in my office working for PricewaterhouseCoopers and asking myself, like, but is this acceptable and does it make sense? And so I think that's what, for me, spiraled my journey into activism, because I then realized that many people actually don't know that they are survivors of something that is atrocious.
Oh my.
And so I think for me, that element of the journey was about how can I now not compromise my voice? How can I have voice? And, you know, you then learn very quickly. And I remember at the time, because the vice president even cited one of, I used to write to the Weekend Post, and I remember even the vice president ended up citing, I think, it was Weekend Post and Duma FM. And then the vice president ended up telling people, you know, and I realized that was one of the excerpts that came when we had people who were sharing their stories, talking about how they're being taken advantage of by married men in Gaborone. And so I think for me, that's when I realized, but I can have a voice regardless of how it comes out. And then more importantly, you then realize people only take you seriously when there's an organization, when there's an institution behind it.
When you're institutionalized,
and so I think that's where, for me, recognizing that entire journey, despite having aspirations to be a chartered accountant, it was really just recognizing, you know what, there's more that I can do. And I think the biggest trigger point was when I had a bonus that the person who I was supervising, their bonus would get into mine 25 times.
Oh my.
So I think for me, that opened my eyes in terms of
Were you doing
inequity.
the same thing?
No, not necessarily the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, at the time, I was in corporate insurance and the executive assistant to a CEO. And so it baffled me at how, you know, we go to work, you know, at the same time.
Yeah.
Yes, our pay is not necessarily the same because I had been headhunted.
Yeah.
But I think for me, what was really difficult to grapple with is how can this individual who has a child, who has a family, have their salary be 25 times less than mine.
Oh, 25 times less?
Yes, essentially. In it,
yeah.
and 25 times. And so I think for me, that's when I think it opened my eyes to inequity.
So you kind of had sympathy?
Yeah, I mean, not
person.
even sympathy. I could feel and understand. Obviously, the individual didn't know, right?
Yeah.
And so I think for me, it didn't make sense as to why. And then you learn that there are some, you know, management practices where, for example, if you ensure that people's bonuses aren't as high, you can get more. And so a lot of these things I was learning on the ground on a daily basis.
It's a bit weird hearing somebody being utterly, I think, upset and wanting to do something about it. And 25 times less. It's usually the person with 25 times less who realizes what, you know, this many times. Consent. So I think just after the break, what I want us to do is just to delve, you know, just deeply into some of these issues that you're seeing and what you would like our government of the day to do. Today where we are. And of course, hashtag yeah, I want us to talk about that. Look, very insightful conversation, a lot of oops moments, a lot of whoa moments. So yeah, I think just after the break, let's continue the conversation.
daughter's sick.
Oh. Gizmo, let's give him our meat pie.
Very good idea.
Good.
There.
The voice that you heard was not me calling you,
Sir?
but the Lord. Go and lie down. If the Lord calls your name, say, "Speak, Lord, your servant."
The Hebrews have brought their God from Shiloh into the battle.
If so, we Philistines are in trouble.
Right, if you were to choose a government today, well, you actually have chosen a government. Are you satisfied with, basically their goals in terms of human rights and, of course, economic development? This is the conversation that, I really want us to delve into. And it's very interesting because our president is somebody who is a human rights lawyer. Well, definitely not limited to that, but it is his approach. On the 10th of December 2024, Human Rights Day, on that day, the president almost shedding a tear about that situation. Our vice president also looking at economic growth, as he is an economist, and a lot of Botswana hela le pele ga nna Muthusa Tautona, but this is the kind of person we need in our cabinet. But this doesn't necessarily mean that because we've got the personnel that we're sure of the success. Yes. We will only be sure when we see that in fact happening. So I just want to understand from your perspective, especially with your background, the human rights perspective of things. What do you think has been lacking generally?
So I think we've seen a disregard of the respect for indigenous people's rights. That's definitely for sure. For more than 3 decades, we've seen the forced relocation. We've seen them being denied basic services and water, and more importantly, denied their ancestral land. And so, what does that mean? And so we appreciate the fact that you have a human rights-based approach to governance, because that means right? And so the fact that we have complied to certain international instruments that say there's individual rights. When you look at the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, that means you're recognized as a people, and that's distinct to Africa because Ubuntu is unique to our continent. There's no other place in the world.
So you think that as we talk about human rights, we have to add that element?
Yes, it's very important because I am because you are. I get my neighbor doesn't have any income, right? And so I think we must recognize that Botswana is one of the most highly unequal countries in the world. I think it was 4th last I remembered, yet we're a higher middle income country. So what does that mean? It means the means of production, the beneficiation of that production is restricted to an elite few. Just think about the fact that when I left corporate, I was part of the 10% that was earning over 10,000 pula. And Ghana, you can imagine at that time, it was very embarrassing when I'd pick up my hand and I was the only person in a company, younger, at least maybe the person who had the next age to me. The next person who was maybe older than me was maybe 8 years older than me, and I was the only one with a mortgage. 23. So I think for me, it's recognizing a lot of Botswana are underemployed, a lot of Botswana are unemployed, and you can imagine when we've got a whole department, ministry, saying that we have 25,000 young people who have dropped out of high school and primary school between 2012 and 2022. And then you've got a whole 3.6 people where a minister is telling you in parliament, we've got 3.6 young people who've dropped out of high school. That already tells you about the demographic of the country. What does that mean about the potential? Was it intentional neglect of the state to not educate its population? Because when you've got an educated population, they make better choices.
And when you talk about better choices, I can imagine that the more educated we are, it will definitely reflect in the economy of the country. Because now you have entrepreneurs, based around the country. And because they've got very different lived experiences. Looking at our economy, what are you hoping to see?
So I'm really hoping that we stimulate a local circular economy. So what does that mean? We don't rely on export and trade because we've already got the assets.
Yeah.
When you look at the many malls that we have and that are still being built in this country, that means there's purchasing power in this country. That means there's resources that can circulate.
Yeah.
When we look at the fact that, for example, Zimbabwe was under sanctions, how are they able to sustain themselves? How are they still able to use rand as a foreign currency for their trade on a day-to-day basis? So we must recognize what we need to harness the informal economy. How do we leverage that potential so that it can work in the circular economy? When we close borders for agricultural purposes, why are we not making or leveraging the resources that we already have so that Botswana are supporting each other? If we know that we've got competitive advantage because it's better to cultivate certain products, why are we not concentrating and channeling state interventions in those locations, knowing full well closer to the desert, we can't do the same? You know, why are we not making sure that the young person in Kachikau is able to leverage the resources that they have available there and use that infrastructure to collaborate with someone else in Okavango? So I think for me, it's about recognizing, yes, one, is that differentiated approach. It's about harnessing how do you adapt to the climate, because we know that that's going to be an impending priority issue in the near future. And how do we ensure that that revolves? How do we ensure that the economy works for Botswana instead of taking money outside just because maybe someone won a tender, Cape Town, Dubai?
Yeah.
How do we lock in those resources? That's by creating an enabling environment. That's by catering to the Botswana who are very different, whether it's ethnic minorities, whether it's indigenous people, or whether it's LGBT individuals who might have different talents.
But I mean, in terms of succeeding with that, I guess by the pele ba ileng gore gongwe ba ka tswa bana le bokgoni jwa go akanya yalo mme gape go diragatsa. I guess, I mean, sitting down, drafting ideas, talking to people like you. You know, one thing I like to say is that the power of the media is that, you know, a certain politician could listen to this interview, pick up something you said and take it to parliament. You'll never know because they hardly, you know, ever really acknowledge whether they heard something. But actualizing, putting that into practice becomes something saying it just seems more difficult to do. Where are we lacking in terms of implementation when we've got so many ideas and creativity in our country?
So I think the question is, what are we not doing, right? Because we have the infrastructure. We've got child protection committees, we've got gender machinery committees, so gender committees at local level, we've got village development committees, and all of these are community representatives.
Yes.
So you essentially have the community that's involved at a local government level that can help you achieve those goals that you want. These are the same people that can continuously give you feedback to say, who don't just identify issues of GBV or teenage pregnancy, but also work on issues of poverty eradication. So the structures are there. We're not using them efficiently, right? Our country has got a distinct, unique attribute in being a dualist legal system. So it's not just civil and criminal law, it's also our tribal governance system. And we know what many things can happen when you're engaging your community, but how do we move away with the gender disparities so that people can come comfortably, then they share their perspectives and develop their own solutions. I think for me, it's recognizing what our solutions are not outside. We already have them embedded in our infrastructure. How do we recalibrate it in such a way that it works for people?
You know, for me, the tricky part is here. I have a solution. I can see something. You've just given an example. How kalema 1, 2, 3. You know, those fruits would definitely yield better than if it was done elsewhere. Because I have that idea. I'm a young person, or even or I'm an experienced farmer, and I'm thinking of this idea, but it's still not being actualized. Where are we lacking in that regard?
So I think it's really about accountability, and we're not acknowledging the fact that we've got a very deep patronage system, political patronage. So essentially, a lot of young people's ideas were dying out because they were being co-opted by certain people, and they were taking those. I mean, we know about the story around the Moe's restaurant and what happened when they had a nice, beautiful aesthetic, right? And so many allegations that came out of them being forced to relocate as a result of powerful political party figures who ended up taking advantage of that same space. And so I think it's recognizing what an elite few's greed has essentially denied Botswana from fulfilling their potential and being prosperous. And I think that's why at the ballot on 30 October, they decided that we need a new government. And so a human rights-based approach to governance and economic growth acknowledges everyone, but not just on an equal perspective, you are also acknowledging that there's an equity perspective that's needed. Ra tlhaloganya gore services di tlamelo di mo toropong. So wena o ileng go motšhudi kana wena o ileng go mookane, you need certain concerted efforts to stimulate. Ra tlhaloganya you don't have an office ya Leah, right? Or a CEDA office.
Yeah.
But now how do we mobilize whatever existing infrastructure is there to cultivate your potential and your talent and your ideas? How do we unlock the resources that we know have been unfortunately going to an elite few to make sure that they can actually benefit the majority? That's through accountability. That's through transparency. So allowing the individual gore a tla botsa mogolo gore mme kana tiro e ya gago ke a service delivery e seng gore you come and say nice things to us
and say nice
make
things
launches.
and then you convince us. All right, I'm giving you 20 seconds. Say something to the new government of the day.
So I think essentially we are hoping for our government to center itself around community, around the diversity that we have. More importantly, I think to advance the rights of people who are living in the margins, people with disabilities, LGBT individuals, young people more especially, as a demographic dividend of this country.
Lovely. Thank you so much for talking to me. It's been an incredible conversation. You know, one thing that I will be doing is talking to just different people in power, leader of opposition, Hela Jalo. After the first 100 days, I would like you to be a part of that conversation. You know, I think it would be nice to do it differently if we can, and you know, and just sit and just exchanging ideas. If that doesn't happen the way I would like it to happen, still, you and I, let's sit on these two couches. And when I within the first 100 days, are you seeing this human-based approach actually being actionalized?
Definitely. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. From Success Capital, yeah, he's said quite a lot. I think please just listen to the interview once again. Let the words marinate. But nonetheless, Dumiso Gacha was our ground shaper for the day.